You have heard the number. 1/3. A forgotten trap sprung in the woods outside a young American city that swallowed 1/3 of the British Army whole and almost ended the Empire's war before it began. It is the kind of fact that feels good to know. The underdog turns the tables. The giant walks into the snare. The redcoats bleed by the thousand in a swamp they never understood. There is only one problem with that story. It is backwards. On the morning of August 27, 1776, a trap did close in the hills above Brooklyn. It was one of the most perfectly executed maneuvers in the history of warfare. 10,000 men moved through the dark without a sound, slipped through a door that had been left unlocked, and appeared behind an army that thought it was winning. By nightfall, close to 1/3 of the men thrown into that fight were shattered, surrendered, drowned, or dead in the marsh grass. It was not the British. The British that day lost fewer than 70 men killed. 63, 64 by some counts, out of more than 20,000 on the field. Less than 1/2%, the army that walked into the trap was American. The men who died in the morass were American. The general who watched his finest soldiers cut down and wrung his hands until they ached was George Washington. And the only reason there was still a United States by the end of that week, the only reason any of the rest of it happened, Trenton, Yorktown, the whole improbable thing, was a storm, a fog, and a regiment of fishermen. So hold on to that number. 1/3. Because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly where it comes from, why it attached itself to the wrong army, and what it actually cost. And you will understand that the truth of Long Island is not a comfortable little victory. It is a near execution, the closest the American Revolution ever came to dying in its cradle. We like to remember the Revolution as a thing that was always going to happen, as if independence, once declared, simply unrolled toward its conclusion. But a declaration is only ink. It does not stop a bayonet. And a matter of weeks after the Continental Congress declared independence in Philadelphia, the largest seaborne invasion force the world had ever assembled was anchored off New York, sent specifically to make those signatures meaningless. Battles are not destiny. They are decisions, hundreds of them, stacked on top of each other, made by exhausted men with bad information in the dark. And at Long Island, almost every decision that mattered went the wrong way for the people who would one day be called the winners. We remember who won the war. We forget how close it came to ending in a single August morning. By the end of this video, you will understand how an army of professional soldiers walked 10,000 men around the side of a sleeping enemy without being seen. You will understand why the door to the entire American position was guarded by 5 men on horseback, and why those 5 men changed nothing. You will understand the suicide stand of 400 Marylanders who turned and charged a stone house 6 times so that everyone behind them could run. You will see the decision a traumatized British general made at the moment of total victory. The decision to stop. The pause that should have ended the rebellion and instead saved it. You will see the storm that came out of the northeast at exactly the right hour, and the fog that came at exactly the right minute, and the boats rowed by men from a fishing town in Massachusetts who carried an entire army across a mile of black water while the enemy slept 300 yards away. And you will finally understand the number, 1/3, where it really lives in this war, what it really killed, and why, like so much of history, the version that travels fastest is the version that is exactly upside down. This is not the story of a trap that killed 1/3 of the British Army. This is the story of the trap that nearly killed America, and the impossible escape that meant it didn't. Long Island was never about who was braver. Both armies had courage to spare, Courage is cheap on a battlefield. It was about who understood the ground, who controlled the water, who knew which door had been left open. It was about information and weather, and the nerve to run when running was the only thing left. These are the moments where nations are decided, not in the documents, but in the mud. If you want more of them told the way they actually happened, hit that subscribe button now. Then let us step back to the spring of 1776, when a defeated British army sailed away from Boston and began planning its revenge. In March of 1776, the British Army did something it was not in the habit of doing. It left. For nearly a year it had been bottled inside Boston, ever since the bloodletting at Bunker Hill the previous June. Then, in a single audacious night, Washington's men had dragged captured cannon onto Dorchester Heights and aimed them down into the city and the fleet in the harbor. General Sir William Howe woke to find American artillery looking down his throat. He had a choice between storming the heights over open ground against entrenched Americans, a phrase that will matter enormously before this story is over, or sailing away. He sailed away, north to Halifax in Nova Scotia, to regroup, to resupply, and to wait for the largest reinforcement Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. Because the British High Command had finally understood the shape of the war they were in. The rebellion was not a Boston problem. It was a continent. And to subdue a continent, you did not chase militia through New England forests. You found the hinge, the one place that, if you held it, split the whole thing in half, and you took it, and you never let go. That hinge was New York. Look at a map the way a British admiral looked at it. The Hudson River runs north out of New York Harbor like a sword laid across the colonies, all the way up toward Canada. Hold the river, and the radical, fevered states of New England are severed from the wealthier, more cautious colonies to the south. Hold the port, and you have the finest deep-water harbor on the coast, wide, sheltered, and crucially ice-free in winter, when half the northern harbors froze solid. New York could be a base in January. New York could supply a war indefinitely. And British intelligence said correctly that New York was full of loyalists, colonists who wanted nothing more than for this whole mad business to end and the king's peace to return. So through the summer of 1776, the ships came. They came in numbers that did not look real. By early July, the masts off Staten Island stood so thick that one rifleman said it looked as if all London had gone to sea and come to anchor in America. More than 400 ships in all, some 70 of them warships of the Royal Navy, the most powerful fighting machines on Earth. Floating fortresses bristling with iron, the rest transports packed with men and horses and guns. 10,000 sailors to crew them. And in the holds and on the decks, soldier after soldier after soldier. Over 7 weeks the British assembled, on and around Staten Island, a ground force of roughly 32,000 professional troops. Not militia, not volunteers with a musket and a grudge. Professionals, men who drilled until loading and firing was a thing their hands did without thought, who would walk in a straight line into fire because walking out of it had been made more terrifying than the enemy. And it was a family operation. The army was commanded by General Sir William Howe. The fleet was commanded by his older brother, Vice Admiral Richard Lord Howe, known to his sailors with rough affection as Black Dick. Together, the brothers Howe held a dual commission, not only to crush the rebellion, but, if possible, to negotiate its surrender. They carried an olive branch in one hand and the largest expeditionary force in British history in the other. There was one more piece. Britain, it turned out, did not have enough Britons willing to come kill Americans. So the Crown went shopping. It signed treaties with 6 German principalities inside the Holy Roman Empire. Hessen-Kassel and Hessen-Hanau chief among them, renting their soldiers for cash. The Americans lumped all of these Germans together under one name, regardless of where they actually came from. Hessians. Remember them. Roughly 8,000 Hessians came ashore in those first landings, and over the course of the war, the number would swell to 30,000. Across the whole conflict, German auxiliaries would make up about 1/3 of the King's forces in North America. 1/3. There it is. The first time. Not killed. Hired. Hold the thought. The Hessians arrived with a reputation that walked in front of them like a cold wind. Elite Jaeger riflemen drawn from gamekeepers and foresters, men who could pick a target at distances that seemed like witchcraft. Grenadiers in towering brass-fronted caps. And the bayonet. The Hessians were artists of the bayonet, and they had been told, falsely, by their British paymasters, that the Americans took no prisoners. Men who believe the enemy will murder them if they surrender do not offer the enemy the chance to surrender either. That lie would drink deep before the day was done. This was the machine now gathering off New York. And waiting for it on the islands was a man with almost nothing to fight it with. George Washington had a problem that no amount of courage could solve. He had to defend an archipelago, and he had no navy. Think about what New York actually is. Manhattan, an island. Long Island, an island. Staten Island, an island. Rivers and bays threaded between them, all of it deep enough to float the Royal Navy, all of it controlled the instant those 70 warships chose to control it. An army that cannot move on water cannot reinforce one island from another if the enemy owns the water in between. Washington could see the trap in the geography itself. He said as much. He understood that forces split across navigable water could not support each other. And yet, he split his anyway, because the alternative was worse. If he abandoned Long Island, the British would seize the heights of Brooklyn, plant their guns, and bombard lower Manhattan into rubble at their leisure. To hold New York at all, he had to hold Brooklyn. To hold Brooklyn, he had to put a large part of his army on Long Island, across a mile of water from the rest, with the enemy fleet free to sail between them whenever it pleased. It was an impossible decision, and he made the bravest version of it, which is not always the wisest version. Now count what he had to make it with. Roughly 19 to 20,000 men on paper. But paper armies and real armies are different things. A large part of his force was state militia, short enlistment men, many of whom had never stood in a battle line, equipped with whatever they had brought from the farm, serving for a few weeks and counting the days until they could legally go home. The Continental regulars were better, but green. Disease moved through the camps like a second enemy. Typhus, dysentery, the bloody flux. On any given morning, thousands who were on the rolls were too sick to lift a musket. Set the two armies side by side, and the contrast is almost unkind. The British and their German auxiliaries, professional infantry hardened in Europe's wars, Scottish Highlanders with broadswords and a reputation for ferocity, Hessian Jaegers and Grenadiers, 40 pieces of artillery, and behind all of it, a navy that owned the sea. On the day of the battle, they would put somewhere between 20 and 24,000 men into the fight. The Americans, a patchwork. Continental regulars still learning their trade, frontier riflemen who could shoot the buttons off a coat but could not stand a bayonet charge, and raw militia who had never heard a cannon fired in anger. No warships. No way to control the water at their backs. On Long Island, Washington had perhaps 6,500 to 10,000 men actually available to defend the line. The command on the American side was a roster of brave, flawed, deeply human men. Israel Putnam, Old Poot, a grizzled veteran of Bunker Hill, courageous to the point of recklessness. John Sullivan, ambitious and capable but stretched thin. And William Alexander, who insisted on being called Lord Stirling because he believed, not without evidence, that he was the rightful heir to a Scottish earldom. A would-be lord fighting for a republic. The Revolution was full of contradictions like that. Across the water, the king's men had their own caste. Sir Henry Clinton, brilliant and prickly. A man who was almost always right and almost always resented for it. Lord Cornwallis, aggressive, capable, hungry. Lieutenant General Leopold von Heister, commanding the Hessians with old-world rigidity. Two armies, one built like a hammer, forged over centuries. One assembled in a few desperate months out of farmers and idealists and whatever could be found. And between them, a wall of wooded hills, 4 narrow doors through it, and the question of whether the Americans understood their own ground well enough to lock all 4. They did not. Before the armies move, you have to understand the man at the top of the British command, because the single most important decision of this entire campaign was made not on the battlefield, but inside William Howe's head. And it was made 14 months before the battle, on a different hill, in a different colony. Bunker Hill, June 1775. Howe had been there. He had personally led the assault. The British plan that day had been the simplest plan in the world. Walk up the hill in lines and take it. The Americans were just militia, dug into earthworks at the top. Howe formed his men in their gorgeous ranks and sent them up the slope into the muzzles of farmers who had been told to hold their fire until they could see the whites of their enemies' eyes. What came back down the hill was a horror. The first assault was shredded. The second was shredded. The British took the hill on the 3rd try only because the Americans ran out of powder. And the price, the British suffered over 1,000 casualties, nearly half of the entire attacking force, in an afternoon. The cream of Howe's officer corps was gone. At one point, Howe stood almost alone, every member of his personal staff around him dead or bleeding, the grass slick with the blood of the best army in the world. He survived by something close to accident. A lesser man might have learned nothing. Howe learned the wrong lesson, or perhaps too strong a version of the right one. He came out of Bunker Hill with a conviction welded into his bones. You do not send infantry uphill, over open ground, against entrenched Americans. Ever. The arithmetic does not work. The Americans, behind earthworks, were not the joke that British contempt assumed. Behind a wall, a farmer with a musket was worth 3 professionals walking toward him. This is the haunted man who now commanded the largest army Britain had ever sent overseas. Aggressive in maneuver, terrified of frontal assaults, a general who would do almost anything. March all night, send 10,000 men hooking around the entire flank of the enemy, rather than send his soldiers straight into a prepared American position again. Hold that in your mind, because it explains everything that is about to happen. It explains the brilliance of the trap, and it explains the catastrophe for Britain of the pause that followed. Howe was about to win the most lopsided victory of the entire war, and the ghost of Bunker Hill was about to make him throw away the empire. To defend Brooklyn, the Americans built 2 lines. Understand both, because the whole battle turns on the difference between them. The inner line was engineering. Beginning in April 1776, first under Major General Charles Lee, and then under the careful hand of Major General Nathaniel Greene, the Americans threw up a chain of fortifications 1.5 miles long across the neck of the Brooklyn Heights Peninsula. It was a real defensive system. Fort Putnam, a star-shaped strongpoint on high ground with clean views of the eastern approaches, where officers met to plan. Fort Greene, another star-shaped redoubt, south of the road that ran down to the Brooklyn Ferry. Fort Box, a diamond-shaped work anchoring the southern end, the oblong redoubt filling the gap between, and linking all of them, deep trenches and abatis, felled trees with their branches sharpened and aimed outward, an 18th century tangle of barbed wire, running from Wallabout Bay in the north all the way down to the tidal marshes of Gowanus Creek in the south. That was the wall the Americans would retreat to. The anvil. If you remember one thing about the inner line, remember this. It had the river at its back, a mile of water between it and Manhattan. It was a strong position to defend and a death trap to be cornered in, because there was nowhere behind it to go but the East River. But the Americans did not intend to fight at the inner line. They intended to fight 2 miles out at the second line. And the second line was not built by men. It was built by the last ice age, the Heights of Guan, also called the Gowanus Heights, a long, heavily wooded ridge of glacial debris, a terminal moraine, the rubble a glacier shoves up in front of itself and leaves behind when it melts, that ran across the whole of Kings County like a green wall. On one side, the flat open plains of Flatbush and Gravesend, where the British would have to land and form up. On the other, the road to the American forts. Between them, this rugged, tangled, steep-sided barrier that an army could not simply walk over. An 18th century army, with its wagons and its artillery and its need to stay in formation, could cross the Heights of Guan in only 4 places. 4 natural passes, 4 doors through the wall. From west to east, the Gowanus Road, also called Martin's Lane, running along the western shore near the harbor. The Flatbush Pass, the central route, cutting through the steepest heart of the ridge. The Bedford Pass, a little to the east of Flatbush. And then, far out on the eastern end, almost forgotten, a narrow ravine called the Jamaica Pass, roughly 4 miles from the main American lines, out on the far left flank, where the ridge tapered away. 4 doors. Lock all 4, and the British are stuck on the wrong side of the wall, forced to attack uphill through the trees against Americans who have felled timber and built breastworks across every gap. Exactly the kind of fight Howe had sworn never to take again. The geography handed Washington a chance to make the British attack into the teeth of the one thing they feared. All he had to do was guard 4 doors. He guarded 3. Sometimes a battle is lost by a fever. Nathaniel Greene was the one man in the American command who truly understood the ground. He had spent months on the Heights of Guan. He had walked the passes. He understood, with something close to obsession, that the entire defense rested on the 4 doors, and that the easternmost door, the Jamaica Pass, far out on the left, was the one nobody would think to watch, and therefore the one that mattered most. Greene had the terrain in his bones. And in the days just before the battle, Greene collapsed. A raging camp fever, probably typhoid, burned through him so badly that he had to be carried off the island to a hospital in Manhattan. The architect of the defense was gone, delirious, at the exact moment the defense was about to be tested. Washington scrambled to replace him. First, he gave the command to John Sullivan. Then, as the British began coming ashore, he layered the senior Major General Israel Putnam over the top in overall command of the Long Island forces. Putnam was a brave old soldier. He was also completely unfamiliar with Kings County. He did not know the ground. He did not carry Greene's obsessive map in his head. He inherited a defensive plan he only half understood, and an enemy he did not have time to study. Under the divided, improvised direction of Putnam and Sullivan, the Americans did guard the passes. Sort of. They posted somewhere between 800 and 1,000 men at each of the 3 western doors: the Gowanus Road, the Flatbush Pass, the Bedford Pass. They felled trees. They built crude breastworks. Reasonable, competent even. And the 4th door, the Jamaica Pass, the one Greene had feared most. They left it guarded by 5 men. 5. 5 mounted militia officers, young, posted out at the eastern ravine essentially as lookouts. Not a force, not a blocking position. 5 men on horseback, expected to do nothing more than notice if something happened and ride back to tell someone. It gets worse. Washington had, until very recently, possessed a unit that existed precisely to prevent this kind of blindness. The Connecticut Light Horse. 500 mounted men, the Army's eyes. Cavalry that could patrol, scout, range out across the country and report what the enemy was doing. And Washington had dismissed them, sent them home. The reason was almost comically mundane. The horses ate too much, and forage was hard to find, and the troopers had been difficult about doing work on foot. So the Army's only real reconnaissance capability was gone, packed off over a question of hay, days before the most important battle of its life. So here is the American position as the sun came up. A strong inner line with the river at its back. A natural wall 2 miles out with 4 doors. 3 doors locked. 1 door, the one that mattered, held by 5 men. And no cavalry to patrol the gap. No eyes ranging the eastern country, nothing to notice if, say, an entire column of 10,000 professional soldiers decided to take a quiet walk in the dark. The British were about to notice the open door long before the Americans did, because the people who lived on that ground were about to tell them. On August 1776, the invasion came. Under the protective broadsides of the Royal Navy frigates, the Phoenix, the Rose, the Greyhound, names that would have meant terror to anyone standing on that beach. The British began putting their army ashore at Gravesend Bay on the southwestern tip of Long Island. It was a masterpiece of logistics, the kind of thing professional armies do and amateur armies only dream of. Flatboats in waves, an advance corps of 4,000 men wading onto the sand in good order. And then the machine simply kept feeding. By noon, 15,000 troops and 40 pieces of artillery were on Long Island soil, without meaningful opposition. There was an American officer there to watch it, Colonel Edward Hand, with his Pennsylvania riflemen. Hand was no coward, and his riflemen were among the best marksmen on the continent. But he could count. 15,000 against a few hundred is not a battle. It is a sacrifice. So Hand did the intelligent, unglamorous thing. He skirmished, he stung where he could, and he fell back into the wooded heights of Guan rather than die contesting an open beach. Good soldiers know when standing is just an elaborate way of throwing your life away. Over the next few days, the British buildup continued, thousands more pouring ashore, including the Hessian divisions under von Heister. By the end of it, the British had something on the order of 20,000 men on Long Island, camped on the open plains south of the wooded ridge. General Howe set up his headquarters in the village of Flatbush, just below the American lines, and looked at the wall of Guan and at the passes and considered his problem. In front of him, a wooded ridge, fortified passes, and beyond them, an entrenched American army. Everything he had sworn at Bunker Hill, never to attack head-on. If he came straight at the passes, he would be sending his infantry uphill through trees against prepared positions, and he could already see the ghosts of his dead officers in the smoke. He would not do it. So Howe listened when his subordinate brought him a different idea. An idea that would let him avoid the frontal assault entirely. An idea built on a single piece of local knowledge, whispered to the British by men who lived on that land and wanted the king to win. The Jamaica Pass was open, and someone was about to tell the British exactly how to use it. Pause the action for a moment, because what the British are about to attempt has a name, and understanding the name is the difference between watching a battle and understanding one. It is called a double envelopment, and it is, when it works, the most decisive maneuver in all of land warfare. The idea is simple to state and almost impossible to execute. You do not attack your enemy's strength. You fix it in place. You hold it by the nose. You make it look at you and worry about you and feed its reserves toward you, while your real force goes around the side, gets behind the enemy, and attacks from the rear. An army facing forward, fighting hard, suddenly discovers that the enemy is also behind it. And an army attacked from front and rear at once cannot fight, because a battle line only works when everyone faces the same way. Turn half your men around and your formation is gone. You are no longer an army. You are a crowd. And crowds, attacked from two sides, do not fight. They die or they run. The greatest generals in history are remembered for this maneuver. Hannibal did it to the Romans at Cannae, surrounding and destroying a larger army almost to the last man. It is the dream that every commander chases and almost none achieve. Because to pull it off, you need three things at once: an enemy who will obligingly stare at your diversion, ground that lets your flanking force move unseen, and the nerve to divide your army in the presence of the enemy, which is the cardinal sin of warfare unless it works, in which case it is genius. At Long Island, the British were about to get all three: an American command that would stare straight ahead at the diversion, a door on the flank that had been left open, and in Henry Clinton, a general with the nerve to bet the campaign on a night march. So when people say a trap killed a third of an army at Long Island, they are not wrong that a trap was sprung. They have only got the direction backwards. The double envelopment was real. It was perfect. And it closed on the Americans. Remember the British intelligence about New York, that it was full of loyalists. That abstract fact now became the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. Local farmers, men who lived in Kings County and wanted the rebellion crushed, came quietly to the British camp with information that no map could give an invading army. They knew the country the way you know your own backyard, and what they told Henry Clinton was this: the Americans had locked 3 of the 4 doors, but the easternmost, the Jamaica Pass, was barely watched at all. A handful of men, a road wide open behind it, and the Loyalists could guide the British there in the dark, along the back lanes, around the American flank, without ever being seen. Clinton heard this and understood instantly what it meant. He went to Howe with a plan that was audacious to the point of recklessness, and exactly suited to a general who refused to attack a fortified line head-on. Divide the army. Send a strong force to make loud, threatening frontal attacks against the western and central passes, Gowanus and Flatbush, to fix the American attention forward, to make them feed their men toward the noise, to convince them that the real battle was happening directly in front of them. Meanwhile, take the main body of the army, the bulk of it, 10,000 men, and march it east in the dead of night. Far around the American left, slip it through the undefended Jamaica Pass, and bring it down like a hammer onto the rear of the entire American forward position. The Americans would be looking south, fighting what they thought was the British Army. And the British Army would actually be behind them, to the north and east, between them and their own forts. It was canny. It was the double envelopment. And it depended entirely on one thing: that 10,000 men could march all night through enemy country without making a sound loud enough to wake 5 militia officers on a ridge. Howe, who would have refused a frontal assault to his last breath, embraced the flank march with relief. This was a battle he could win without walking uphill into American muskets. He gave the order. On the night of August 26th, the trap was set in motion. At 9 o'clock on the night of August 26th, 1776, in full darkness, the column began to move. 10,000 men, dragoons on horseback, light infantry, grenadiers, the Scottish Highlanders, and field guns rolling with them. The cream of the British Army, with Clinton in the vanguard, Cornwallis in support, and Howe himself riding along, the senior commanders staking everything on this single roll. They marched east, away from the American lines, away from the obvious battle, into the rural dark. And they marched in silence. Try to imagine the discipline that requires. 10,000 men, thousands of horses, cannon on iron-rimmed wheels, moving across miles of farm country in the middle of the night. And the order is absolute quiet. No talking, no clatter. The whole column threading along the King's Highway and the back lanes, with loyalist guides at the front who knew every fence and ford and turning, steering the army around any place an American patrol might be, keeping it out of sight, keeping it silent. An army the size of a city, moving like a single man trying not to wake the house. The miles fell away in the dark. East, then north, then west. A great curving hook around the entire American left flank. Hour after hour. Men who had landed days before and were already tired now marched all night with weapons and packs. And they did it without a sound, because they had been told that surprise was everything and silence was surprise. Think about what that night was actually like for the men in the column. You cannot clearly see the man in front of you. You are forbidden to speak. Your mouth is dry and you are not allowed to call for water. Your feet are blistering and you cannot complain. You do not entirely know where you are going, only that you are marching around something, and that at the end of it, there will probably be a battle, and that if a single fool among 10,000 drops his musket on a stone or coughs at the wrong moment, the whole army might be discovered and the whole gamble undone. The discipline this demanded was not the discipline of the parade ground. It was the discipline of the hunt, the absolute stillness of a predator that knows one sound will empty the field. For 9 hours, 10,000 men were that predator, padding through the dark of Kings County, and the only people awake to hear them were loyalist farmers who had every reason to keep their silence too. There is a kind of genius in logistics that never makes it into the paintings, and this was it. Not a charge, not a heroic volley, just thousands of exhausted men choosing, mile after mile after mile, to make no noise at all. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the vanguard reached the Jamaica Pass. And there were the 5 men, the 5 American officers, the only thing the entire defense had placed in the path of the main British Army. They were not even watching the pass, exactly. They were sheltering nearby, almost certainly with no conception that anything larger than a patrol could possibly be out in that country at that hour. The British took them without firing a shot. That detail is everything. Not a single musket went off, because a single shot in the dark would have cracked across those hills and reached the American lines, and an alert officer might have wondered what it meant. And the whole maneuver depended on no one wondering anything. The 5 scouts were simply surrounded and seized, silently, and the alarm was never raised. The eyes of the American left were put out without a sound. And then the column poured through the open door. By dawn, the entire 10,000 had crossed the Jamaica Pass and halted near the village of Bedford to rest and form up. completely undetected. They were now sitting directly behind the American forward lines, behind Sullivan, behind Sterling, behind the men in the passes who were at that very moment getting ready to fight what they believed was the main British attack coming at them from the south. The jaws of the trap were open and set. To the south, the diversion was already beginning to roar. To the north and east, 10,000 men waited in the gray morning light for the signal. The Americans were facing exactly the wrong way. While 10,000 men crept into position behind the American line, the British made sure the Americans kept looking the other way. Around midnight, on the American right, the western end, near the Gowanus Road in a tavern called the Red Lion, British Major General James Grant began to press. Grant was the perfect man for the job, partly because of his arrogance. He had famously boasted in Parliament that he could march from one end of the American continent to the other with 5,000 men, that the colonists would not and could not fight. He believed his own contempt. And so when he was ordered to make a diversion look like a real attack, he threw himself into it with the conviction of a man who thought he might as well win the whole thing himself. Facing him was Lord Sterling. As the sun came up, Sterling deployed his best troops, the elite Delaware Regiment and the 1st Maryland Regiment, into a proper European battle line and met Grant's regulars volley for volley. This was warfare by the textbook. 2 lines of men in the open, loading and firing in disciplined sequence, the air filling with smoke. And the Americans held. They stood and traded fire with British regulars and did not break. And the longer they held, the more certain they became that they were facing the main British effort, that they were winning the battle, that the day was theirs. They were holding the nose of the bull, while the horns swung around behind them. In the center, at the Flatbush Pass, John Sullivan faced the Hessians under von Heister. Here the deception was even more deliberate. The Hessians opened a furious artillery bombardment, hammering the American center, making all the noise of a serious assault. But they held their infantry back. They did not charge. They waited because they were under strict orders not to advance, until they heard a particular signal. Cannon fire from the direction of Bedford, far to the rear, which would mean that Clinton's flanking column had completed its march and was in position behind the enemy. So the morning of August 27th unfolded as a beautiful, terrible piece of theater. The Americans in the passes heard cannon and musketry in front of them and concluded the battle was a frontal slugging match that they were handling well. They fed more men forward toward the noise. Their commanders, Sullivan and Sterling, focused entirely on the enemy they could see, and not one of them knew that the largest part of the British army was sitting behind them in the morning light, resting, waiting, watching their backs. 10,000 men who had walked all night to be exactly there. The trap was complete. All that remained was the signal. At 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 heavy British cannon fired near Bedford. It was the signal. It meant the flanking column was in position. And the moment those 2 guns spoke, the entire battle inverted in an instant. In the center, von Heister's Hessians fixed bayonets and surged up the Flatbush Pass straight into Sullivan's front. At the same moment, Clinton's 10,000, the men from the night march, came down out of the north and east and crashed into the American rear. The 2 forces drove toward each other with the Americans caught in between. There is a particular kind of horror in being a soldier at that moment. You are facing south, fighting the Hessians charging up the hill at you with their long bayonets and their belief that you will give them no quarter, and then you hear firing behind you. You turn, and there are redcoats and Highlanders coming at your back, from the direction of your own forts, from the one direction that was supposed to be safe. There is nowhere to face. The line, which only works when everyone faces the same way, dissolves. The army becomes a crowd, and the crowd, caught in the crossfire between the Hessians in front and the British behind, breaks. What followed was not a battle anymore. It was a slaughter and a panic. In 18th century warfare, a unit caught out of formation and hit from the rear is essentially defenseless. Discipline was the only thing that made these men dangerous, and discipline was gone. The Hessians, believing the lie that Americans murdered prisoners, fought with a ferocity that crossed into atrocity, bayoneting men against trees, cutting down soldiers who threw up their hands to surrender. The Highlanders were no gentler. Men who tried to give up were killed where they stood. Men who ran were chased through the woods and the cornfields and run down. John Sullivan, the American commander in the center, was caught in a cornfield and captured. His entire division simply came apart, the survivors scattering north through the trees toward the only safety left. The inner fortifications on Brooklyn Heights, the Anvil Line, the wall with the river at its back. Across the front, the story was the same. The men who had been so sure they were winning discovered all at once that the enemy was everywhere, that they were surrounded, that the morning of confident volleys had been a stage play with them as the unknowing victims. The American forward line, the whole forward line, collapsed. And remember the number we are holding. By the end of that morning, the Americans had lost some 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. And measured against the force actually committed to that forward fight, that loss ran close to a third. A third of an army shattered in the woods above Brooklyn. That is the real 1/3 of Long Island. It happened. The trap worked exactly as designed. It just closed on the people who would one day be telling the story. Step back from the screaming for a moment and look at what just happened with the cold eye of a strategist, because it is worth seeing how completely it worked. Phase 1. Intelligence. The Loyalist farmers told Clinton the eastern door was open. The Americans had left it guarded by 5 men and had dismissed the cavalry that might have caught the column on the march. Knowledge against blindness. Phase 2. The march. 10,000 men moved all night, in silence, around the entire enemy flank, and arrived behind the enemy without raising the alarm, capturing the only scouts without firing a shot. Movement against stillness. Phase 3. The distraction. Grant and von Heister pinned the American front, made noise, made the Americans certain the battle was where it was not, and lured them into feeding troops forward, deeper into the closing trap. Deception against confidence. Phase 4. The envelopment. The signal guns fired. The Hessians charged the front, the flanking column hit the rear, and the American line, caught between 2 fires, unable to face both ways, disintegrated. The vice against the formation. 4 phases, each one feeding the next, executed across an entire night and morning, over miles of country, by an army the size of a city. It is genuinely one of the cleanest double envelopments in military history, and it is barely remembered because the side that lost it went on to win the war, and winners write the textbooks they want to read. The American forward defense had been annihilated. The center was gone, Sullivan captured, the militia in flight. By every rule of war that mattered in 776, the battle was over and the British had won it completely. Except that on the American right, one man and his Marylanders had not gotten the message that they were beaten. And what they did next is the reason the rest of this story exists at all. Lord Stirling, on the American right, was still fighting Grant. He was still holding his line, still trading disciplined volleys, still convinced he was facing the main British attack and handling it well. And he had no idea that the entire rest of the American army had just been destroyed behind him. that his left and his rear had evaporated, that he was now a single, isolated wing standing alone on a battlefield that had already been lost. Then, by late morning, the truth arrived in the form of Cornwallis's troops appearing behind him, cutting the road back to Brooklyn Heights. Sterling turned and understood his situation in a single terrible glance. He was trapped. His force, roughly 1,600 men, was caught in a closing box. Grant's regulars to the south, Cornwallis's Highlanders and Grenadiers to the east, sitting astride the only escape route. And to the west and north, the one direction that should have been an exit, the impassable tidal marshes of Gowanus Creek, deep and muddy and running at high tide. And Sterling understood something larger than his own predicament. If his wing was simply destroyed where it stood or surrendered, the British would have a clean, open road straight to the main American forts on Brooklyn Heights, where Washington was, where the core of the Continental Army was, exhausted and disorganized and not yet behind their walls. A British rush at that moment might take the forts, capture Washington, and end the war that very afternoon. Sterling's trapped, doomed wing was, at that instant, the only thing standing between the British and the decapitation of the entire revolution. So he made a decision that belongs in the small, sacred catalog of military choices that are both tactically sound and morally staggering. He would buy time with blood, his own men's blood. He ordered the bulk of his command, the Delaware Regiment and most of his other troops, to break off and ford the Gowanus Marsh immediately, to get across the creek any way they could and run for the main lines, and to cover them, to hold Cornwallis off long enough for them to escape. He kept back a single detachment, roughly 400 men of the 1st Maryland, under the direct command of Major Mordecai Gist, the men history would remember as the Maryland 400. And with those 400, Lord Sterling turned around and attacked Cornwallis. Understand what that means. 400 men, already exhausted, already surrounded, deliberately turning to charge a vastly superior, well-positioned force, not to win, because winning was impossible, but to die slowly enough that their friends could get away. Cornwallis had anchored his position at a sturdy Dutch stone farmhouse, the Vechte Cortelyou House. History would remember it as the Old Stone House, and fortified it, packing it with troops and sweeping the approaches with artillery. It was a strong point. To attack it was to walk into massed musketry and cannon fire across open ground. The Marylanders attacked it anyway. And then they did it again. And again. 6 times. 6 times the Maryland 400 charged the Old Stone House. 6 times they came across that ground into the volleys and the grape shot. And astonishingly, they pushed the British advance guard back. They made Cornwallis stop and turn and pour men into holding them off. They made one of the king's best generals worry about 400 trapped men when he should have been marching on the American forts. From a redoubt on Cobble Hill, George Washington watched it happen. He could see the Marylanders charging and falling and charging again. And he could do nothing to help them. And he understood exactly what they were buying and exactly what it was costing. The words attributed to him in that moment have come down through 2.5 centuries. Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose. He lost them. Of the 400 who turned to fight, 256 were killed or captured. Some companies were effectively wiped out, casualty rates approaching 80%, 8 men in 10 gone. The 1st Maryland was shattered as a unit. Lord Sterling himself, when the end finally came and there was nothing left to do, refused the bitter humiliation of surrendering his sword to an English officer, and instead fought his way across to the Hessian lines and surrendered to General von Heister. a small, fierce act of spite at the bottom of a catastrophe. But the sacrifice did exactly what it was meant to do. The 6 charges, the dying, the hour the Marylanders bought with their lives, gave the rest of Sterling's wing the time to plunge into the Gowanus Marsh and run for the lines. The road to Brooklyn Heights, which had stood open for the taking, was kept closed by 400 men just long enough. There is your other 1/3 and more. Not the British Army. A single American regiment, losing far more than 1/3 of its strength in a single morning so that an army could live. For the men Sterling sent to escape, salvation lay across the Gowanus Creek. And the Gowanus Creek was trying to kill them too. It was a wide, muddy tidal estuary, a salt marsh threaded with deep channels, the kind of ground that is treacherous even when no one is shooting at you. And the timing could not have been worse. The battle coincided with high tide, which meant the creek was at its deepest and most turbulent, the channels swollen, the mud beneath the water soft and bottomless. Into this, exhausted men threw themselves. They had been fighting and running for hours. They wore heavy woolen uniforms that soaked up water like sponges, leather cartridge boxes, and they carried muskets they were loath to abandon. And behind them came the British light infantry and the Hessians, lining the high ground and firing down into the marsh. Musket balls and grape shot snapping into the water and the mud, and the men struggling through it. It was a nightmare made of multiple deaths at once. Men were shot in the water. Men sank into the muddy bottom that gripped like quicksand and could not pull free. Men in water up to their waists, their chests, their necks, dragged under by the weight of their own equipment and the soft suck of the marsh, simply drowned and suffocated in the morass while the fire came down on them. And yet there was heroism even here, in the worst place on the field. Captain Samuel Smith swam the creek and hauled back wooden planks and boards, lashing together a crude makeshift ferry to carry across the men who could not swim. James Peale, the brother of Charles Wilson Peale, the famous painter, the man who gave us the iconic portraits of the founders, struggled through that mud and lost his shoes, his baggage, his papers, nearly his life. Ordinary men, doing extraordinary things in chest-deep filth under fire, so that the man next to them might live. A Scottish officer, watching the slaughter in the marsh from dry ground, recorded what he saw with the casual cruelty of a man who has decided the people dying are not quite people. That multitudes of the rebel infantry drowned and suffocated in the morasses, and that it was a proper punishment for rebels. That is how the enemy saw it. Vermin caught in a flood. But despite all of it, the tide, the mud, the fire, the contempt, hundreds of Continentals dragged themselves up onto the far shore, onto the safety of the Brooklyn Heights side, and stumbled into the defensive lines, soaked, freezing, half-drowned, utterly broken in body and spirit. Alive, because 400 Marylanders had bought them the minutes, and a few brave men had built a ferry out of swamp wood. They were alive. And being alive, it would turn out, was the only thing that mattered. Because an army that survives a lost battle can fight a war. The whole of the next 2 years, and everything after, depended on the simple, grinding fact that these men were not dead. But they were not safe. Not even close. They were now crammed into the inner fortifications, a 1.5-mile perimeter, with their backs to a mile of open water and the most powerful navy on Earth somewhere out in the dark, getting ready to close the only way out. Let us stop and count, because the counting is where the myth finally dies. The British, on the day of the battle, out of an engaged force of roughly 20,000, lost about 63 to 64 men killed, and around 314 wounded or missing. a total casualty rate of less than 2%. By the standards of 18th century battle, that is not a victory. It is a demonstration. It is what it looks like when one army so completely outthinks another that the fighting barely scratches it. The Americans lost roughly 2,000 men in all, around 300 killed, 600 to 800 wounded, and over 1,000 captured, including 2 major generals, Sullivan and Sterling, taken prisoner. Measured against the whole force Washington had on Long Island, that was something like a fifth. Measured against the men actually thrown into the forward fight in the passes, and the Gowanus, it ran closer to a third. And the units flung in deepest, like the Maryland 400, were gutted far worse still. So when the story says a trap at Long Island cost one army a third of its strength, the story is reaching for something true and pointing it at the wrong target. The devastating losses were American. The trap was British, and the 60-some British dead are the final, unanswerable proof. You do not lose a third of an army and bury 60 men. You lose a third of an army and bury thousands. The arithmetic alone refutes the legend. Hold the number a little longer. We are almost to where it really comes from. For now, understand what the battle was. Not a glorious American near miss, a near execution. The Continental Army had been caught, enveloped, and broken in a single morning, and was now penned against a river by an enemy that had lost almost nothing doing it. By every rule of war, the rebellion should have ended within the week. What saved it was not a battle. It was a man's hesitation, a storm, and a fog. By late afternoon on August 27th, the British had won. Not partly, completely. The American forward line was destroyed. 2 generals were prisoners. A third of the engaged force was gone, and the survivors were crammed into the Brooklyn Heights fortifications with the East River at their backs and nowhere left to run. The British Army, flush with victory, drunk on the adrenaline of a perfect day, advanced right up to musket range of the American earthworks. And the men in the ranks, the junior officers, the soldiers who could smell the end of the war, wanted to finish it. There was a fervor in them. One more push, storm the works, take the forts, capture Washington and the heart of the Continental Army, and be home by Christmas with the rebellion in a box. Many of them were certain it could be done, and done that evening. And General William Howe ordered them to stop, pull back, out of range, dig siege trenches. We will do this the slow, correct, professional way. It is one of the most ferociously debated decisions of the entire war, and to understand it, you have to go back to the ghost we met earlier. Howe looked at those American earthworks, packed with desperate men, and he did not see a beaten enemy ready to crumble. He saw Bunker Hill. He saw his officers dead in the grass. He saw the price of sending infantry over open ground against entrenched Americans. And every instinct he had screamed that to storm those works would be to pay that price again, perhaps worse. He had called such victories too dear bought, too expensive in the only currency that mattered to him, the lives of his professionals. And from where Howe stood, there was no need to take the risk. The Americans were trapped. The Royal Navy controlled the harbor. He could sit, dig, bring up his guns, and batter the forts into submission at his leisure, spending shells instead of soldiers. Why gamble? The rebels had nowhere to go. It was, by the textbook of 18th century siege warfare, a defensible decision. It was also, in hindsight, a catastrophe for the British Empire. His own subordinate, Henry Clinton, the architect of the brilliant trap, would argue bitterly for the rest of his life that had Howe pressed the victory at Long Island, he would have ended the rebellion then and there. Clinton was almost certainly right. The single afternoon's hesitation, born of a 15-month-old trauma, gave the Americans the one thing they needed and had no right to expect: time. But Howe's whole calm calculation rested on one assumption that he treated as a certainty. The Americans were trapped because they could not cross the East River. And they could not cross the East River because the moment they tried, Admiral Lord Howe would sail his warships up into it and blow any boats out of the water. The Navy was the lid on the box. As long as the Navy could enter the river, Washington's army was finished. It was only a question of whether by bombardment or by storm. The Navy never made it into the river. And the reason was the weather. On August 28th, the wind turned. A fierce nor'easter, the brutal coastal storm that New Englanders know and dread, blew into New York Harbor, and it blew steadily, relentlessly, out of the northeast. To a modern reader, that is a weather report. To the British fleet in 1776, it was a wall. These were square-rigged sailing warships. They could not simply point where they wished and go. They worked the wind, and to drive up the narrow East River, they needed wind that would push them up it, or at least enough room to tack against it. A steady gale blowing straight down the river from the northeast made it physically impossible for Lord Howe's warships to sail up into the East River at all, the most powerful navy on Earth. The lid on the trap, the entire reason the Americans were doomed. And it was pinned in place by the wind, unable to take its station, unable to close the one escape route. The storm did more than that. Torrential rain came down on both armies for 2 days. It turned the freshly dug British siege trenches into muddy canals. It soaked the powder of the American sentries until their muskets would not fire. It made everyone, on both sides, miserable, cold, and blind. But its decisive work was done out on the water. It held the Navy off. And Washington, soaked and exhausted in his lines, understood what the wind was telling him. He understood it was a reprieve, not a rescue, and that it would not last. The fortifications were overcrowded and broken in morale. Disease was spreading. The men were beaten. And the instant that wind shifted, the instant it backed around and let the warships up the river, the lid would slam down and the army would die in the box. He had a window. He did not know how wide. On the evening of August 29th, he called his generals together in a council of war, and he made the decision that would define him as a commander and very probably save the United States. He would take the entire army off Long Island, in the dark, across a mile of open water, under the nose of an enemy camped a few hundred yards away, without being detected. And he would do it before the wind changed. It should not have been possible. To withdraw an army in contact with the enemy is one of the hardest maneuvers in war. One alarm, one careless noise, and the retreating force is caught with its back to the water and slaughtered. Washington was proposing to do it with broken troops, at night, by boat, across a mile of tidal river, with 9,000 men. He had two things going for him. He had a regiment of men who lived on the water, and he was about to get one more gift from the weather that no one could have planned. The evacuation of Brooklyn Heights is by a wide margin one of the most brilliantly executed operations in the history of warfare. And almost no one outside of military historians has ever heard of it. It began with boats. Washington ordered every flat-bottomed boat, every skiff, every rowboat, every scrap of anything that would float, requisitioned from the Manhattan shore and brought across under cover of darkness, and to handle them. To row a mile of treacherous, current-ridden tidal river in the dark, in driving rain, back and forth all night, carrying soldiers and horses and cannon. He turned to the one unit in his army built for exactly this. The 14th Continental Regiment, the men of Marblehead and Beverly, Massachusetts. fishermen and sailors and dockhands, commanded by Colonel John Glover. These were not soldiers who happened to be near the water. These were watermen who happened to be soldiers, men who had spent their whole lives reading currents and handling small craft in bad conditions off a hard coast. Glover's mariners took the oars, and then the army began to disappear. The genius of it was the secrecy. The withdrawal had to be invisible, not just to the British, but at first even to the American troops themselves. Because 9,000 frightened, exhausted men told, "We are retreating across the river," might panic, might rush the boats, might fall apart. So they were not told. The men were quietly pulled out of the lines and marched to the ferry landing under the impression that they were being repositioned, perhaps for a night attack on the British. The truth was kept from almost everyone. The wheels of the artillery carriages and the supply wagons were muffled with rags so they would not rumble on the road. Orders were passed in whispers. As units left the trenches, the remaining men spread out to keep the line looking occupied, so that a British sentry peering through the rain would see what he expected to see: a manned American position, and not the slow, silent hemorrhage of an entire army out the back and across the water. All night the boats went back and forth, a mile each way, loaded with men to the gunwales, riding low, Glover's mariners pulling at the oars against the current and the wind and the dark. Land on the Manhattan side, unload, turn around, row back for more. Again and again and again, hour after hour, with the British camped close enough that a shout would have carried. And it was nearly not enough. The math of the night was terrifyingly tight. There were thousands of men to move, and only so many boats, and only so many hours of darkness. And for much of the night, the wind that was holding the Navy at bay was also fighting the rowboats, chopping up the river and slowing every crossing. There came a point in the small hours when it looked as though the dawn would arrive, with much of the army still on the Brooklyn shore. When the operation seemed certain to fail in its final stretch, to be caught half-finished with the slowest, most exposed men still waiting at the landing. An officer was said to have ordered a change to ease the crossing, and in the confusion part of the line was very nearly pulled out of the trenches too early, which would have shown the British an empty front while half the army still stood in the open at the water's edge. The mistake was caught and reversed in the dark. The line held its shape. The boats kept moving. Everything that night ran on a knife's edge between miracle and massacre, and it stayed, impossibly, on the miracle side. But only just, and only because men kept their heads when one panicked word would have undone all of it. And then dawn began to come, and the operation was not finished. This was the moment of maximum danger. A substantial part of the American rear guard was still in the trenches as the sky began to lighten in the east. In full daylight, the British pickets would see the half-empty lines, would understand instantly what was happening, would raise the alarm, and would fall on the remnant and the crowded boats and turn the miracle into a massacre at the water's edge. And then the fog came. Out of the morning, off the river and over the heights, rolled a dense, thick, pea-soup fog, the kind you cannot see 50 feet through. It settled over Brooklyn and the East River and drew a curtain across the whole withdrawal. The British, a few hundred yards away, could see nothing. And under that fog, which lingered on the American side while reportedly lifting earlier across the water, the last of the rear guard was rowed away. When the fog finally burned off and the British skirmishers crept forward to the American lines, they found the trenches empty, silent, abandoned. The entire army was gone. Washington had evacuated 9,000 men, with their provisions and the bulk of their artillery, across a mile of open water, at night, in a storm, under the nose of the most powerful army and navy on Earth, and lost not a single life in the crossing. Not one. And by every account, the last man to step from the Brooklyn shore into a boat, refusing to leave while any of his soldiers remained, was George Washington himself. The trap had closed, and the army had walked out of it through a curtain of fog, rowed by fishermen, while the wind held the navy at bay. The British had won the battle so completely they barely bled. And they had let the prize, the army, the war, the future, slip across a river in the dark. Now, the number, 1/3. Let us finally put it where it belongs, because the truth of it is its own kind of story. The figure is not invented. It runs all through the American Revolution like a thread. The problem is only that the popular legend grabbed the thread and tied it to the wrong place, to a fictional massacre of the British Army at Long Island that never happened. So where does 1/3 actually live in this war? In place after place, sometimes as a clean third, sometimes a quarter, sometimes far worse. And every one of them is more interesting than the myth. First, the Hessians. We met them at the start. German auxiliaries rented from 6 principalities, made up roughly 1/3 of the total British troop strength in North America across the war. When you picture a British army in the Revolution, 1 in 3 of those men was, in fact, German. That is a genuine 1/3, not killed, but bought. The crown unable to find enough of its own subjects willing to come and do the killing. Second, the people themselves. There is a long-standing estimate going back to John Adams and repeated by generations of historians that the American population split roughly into thirds. About 1/3 actively supported the rebellion, about 1/3 remained loyal to the crown, and about 1/3 just wanted to be left alone. The revolution was not a united people throwing off a tyrant. It was, in large part, a civil war, with 1/3 of the country on the king's side. That loyalist third is exactly what gave the British the local farmers who whispered the route through the Jamaica Pass. Third, Guilford Courthouse, 1781. Late in the war, in North Carolina, Lord Cornwallis fought Nathaniel Greene, the same Greene whose fever had crippled the Long Island defense, now recovered and become one of the most dangerous generals in America. Cornwallis won the field, but he lost about 1/4 of his army doing it. Killed and wounded, a victory so ruinous that the opposition leader Charles James Fox declared in Parliament that another such victory would ruin the British Army. Not quite 1/3, but the same kind of wound and the same kind of trap, winning a battle you cannot afford. Fourth, Kings Mountain, 1780. A force of roughly 1,000 Loyalist militia under Major Patrick Ferguson, a substantial slice of the King's strength in the southern backcountry, was hunted down and destroyed almost to a man by frontier riflemen, tearing away a large part of Cornwallis's Loyalist manpower in a single afternoon and helping turn the tide of the Southern War. Fifth, and this one closes a circle, the Maryland line at Camden in 1780. The very same Maryland soldiers, the descendants in arms of the regiment gutted at the old stone house, were cut to pieces again 4 years later at the disaster of Camden, losing men by the 100, on some accounts close to 1/3 of their strength. The Marylanders kept being asked to be the ones who stood when everyone else ran, and they kept paying the third, the half, the 80%, over and over, for the length of the war. And sixth, reaching back before the Revolution to the French and Indian War. By some estimates, Irish soldiers made up nearly 1/3 of the British regulars in North America. Another portion of the army hired or pressed from the margins of the empire to fight its wars far from home. So the number is true. It is everywhere. It is Hessians and Loyalists and shattered regiments and Pyrrhic victories. What it is not, what it has never been, is 64 dead British soldiers in the woods above Brooklyn, somehow inflated into a third of an army. The legend took a real and haunting feature of this war, that it was fought 1/3 by foreigners against a country split in thirds, at a cost that broke unit after unit by the third, and flattened it into a comfortable lie that put the bleeding on the other side. The truth is harder and better. The 1/3 that was lost at Long Island was lost by the Maryland 400 and by the engaged American force as a whole. The army that was nearly destroyed was Washington's, and the empire that walked away from its perfect victory was Britain's. History does not travel well. The version that spreads is the version that is easy to feel good about. But the version worth knowing is almost always the one underneath. Slower, sadder, and far more dangerous than the slogan on top of it. The miracle evacuation saved the army. It did not save New York, and it did not end the danger. It only meant the danger continued. Washington took his soaked, broken army back to Manhattan, and he could see that the city itself was indefensible. With the Royal Navy able to land troops anywhere on its shores, holding Manhattan was just offering the British a second, larger trap. On September 5th, Nathanael Greene, now recovered from the fever that had cost so much, urged Washington to give up New York City entirely, warning that another decisive defeat would shatter the army's fragile morale and likely end the whole cause. On September 15th, Howe came across. British and Hessian troops landed at Kips Bay on Manhattan, behind a naval bombardment so enormous and deafening that the inexperienced Connecticut militia guarding the shore broke and ran without firing a shot. Washington rode into the chaos in a towering, despairing rage, trying to rally fleeing men who would not be rallied, riding so close to the advancing British that his own aides had to physically seize his horse's bridle and lead him away before he was killed or captured. It was the lowest moment of a low season. A commander-in-chief so disgusted by his army's collapse that he seemed, for a few minutes, not to care whether he lived. The Americans gave up the lower half of Manhattan and fell back to defenses at Harlem Heights. Through the autumn of 1776, Howe pushed them north and east with patient, professional pressure. White Plains, a series of flanking moves, always maneuvering, rarely storming, the lesson of Bunker Hill never far from his mind. And in November came the worst single blow of the campaign, the fall of Fort Washington on Manhattan, where a massive British and Hessian assault captured the garrison whole, some 2,800 more American soldiers taken prisoner in a day, along with irreplaceable cannon and stores. After that, what was left of Washington's army, starving, freezing, its enlistments expiring, men deserting by the day, was driven across New Jersey and over the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, dwindling with every cold mile. By the close of 1776, New York City was firmly in British hands. It would stay in British hands as the headquarters of their entire war effort in America, until they finally sailed away in 1783, 7 years later. And yet, the army still existed. That is the whole point. Battered down to a few thousand desperate men, it still existed because it had not been destroyed on Long Island, because it had crossed the river in the fog. And out of that survival came the thing that mattered most. Washington learned. Long Island taught him in the hardest possible way that he could not win a stand-up European war of fixed positions against the finest professional army in the world. His raw militia would not stand against Hessian bayonets in the open. His fortified lines could be turned by a night march and a whispered map. So he stopped trying to win that war. He adopted what historians call the Fabian strategy. after the Roman who wore down Hannibal by refusing to fight him head-on. Avoid the big, decisive battle. Preserve the army above all else, because the army was the revolution. As long as it existed, the cause existed. Skirmish, retreat, harass, survive, and stretch the war out until British political will and British money ran dry. It was not a glamorous strategy. It was a strategy of running away on purpose, for years. And it won the war. Everything from the desperate Christmas gamble at Trenton a few weeks later to the final trap that closed on Cornwallis at Yorktown 5 years on grew out of the cold lesson learned in the Brooklyn mud. The goal is not to win the battle. The goal is to still have an army tomorrow. He still had an army tomorrow. Because of a storm, a fog, 400 Marylanders, and a regiment of fishermen. There is a part of Long Island that the legend never touches, because it is not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic. It is slow. It happened to the more than 1,000 Americans who did not die in the trap and did not escape across the river, the ones who were captured. Sullivan and Sterling, the two generals, would eventually be exchanged, traded back like valuable pieces. The ordinary men were not so lucky. And what happened to them is, by the cold arithmetic of death, the deadliest thing in this entire story. The British had won New York, and New York became their great base for the rest of the war. It also became the place where they kept their prisoners. There were not enough buildings. The churches and sugar houses filled quickly. So the British turned to the harbor. In the shallow tidal water of Wallabout Bay, on the Brooklyn side, just north of the very ground where the battle had been fought, they anchored old, rotting, dismasted warships. Hulks, floating prisons, and into them they packed captured Americans by the thousand. The most infamous of them, as the war ground on, was a decommissioned 60-gun warship called the Jersey, stripped of her masts and guns and left to rot at anchor. The prisoners called her simply Hell. Below her decks, in the dark, with little air and less food, men were crammed together in numbers the space could not hold. Disease did what disease does in such places. Dysentery, smallpox, typhus, yellow fever moving through bodies already starved and weakened. The food was rotten, the water foul. Each morning, the guards would open the hatch and call down the same phrase that every prisoner came to dread. Rebels, turn out your dead. And the living would carry up the bodies of the men who had died in the night. And those bodies would be rowed to the shore of Wallabout Bay and buried in shallow sand, barely covered, so that for years afterward the tides and the rains uncovered bones along that beach. Children of the next generation grew up finding skulls in the mud. Here is the number that should be remembered, and almost never is. Over the course of the war, more American soldiers and sailors died aboard the New York prison ships than were killed in all the battles of the Revolution combined. Estimates of the dead range from around 8,000 to as many as 11 or 12,000. The figure most often cited is roughly 11,000, more than Bunker Hill and Long Island and Brandywine and Monmouth and every other field put together. They did not die charging a stone house or holding a line. They died in the dark, slowly, of neglect, within sight of the city they had been fighting for. The men captured in the trap above Brooklyn were among the first to make that grim voyage out to the hulks. Some of them surely were men of the Maryland 400 who had not died at the old stone house, who had survived the 6 charges only to surrender, and to be rowed out to Wallabout Bay, and to die there over the following months in the dark. Long after the war, the bones along that shore became a national shame, and then a national memory. The remains that could be gathered were eventually collected, and today, in Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn, named for the very general whose fever helped lose the battle. A towering monument stands over a crypt holding what could be recovered of the prison ship martyrs. It is one of the least visited major monuments in New York. Most people who walk past it have no idea what it marks. That is the part of the trap that kept killing after the battle was over, not a clean death in combat. A long one in a rotting ship for many thousands of men whose names, for the most part, no one wrote down. When we count the cost of Long Island, we usually stop at the battlefield. We should not. The trap's longest shadow fell on the water of Wallabout Bay, and it fell for years. So why does almost no one know this? Why is the largest battle of the Revolutionary War, the first great test of the United States, a near execution survived by a miracle, a footnote while we all know the whites of their eyes at Bunker Hill and the crossing of the Delaware? History forgets along predictable lines, and Long Island failed nearly every test for being remembered. It was a defeat. Nations build their founding stories out of victories, not catastrophes. Bunker Hill was a moral victory. The crossing of the Delaware and Trenton were a comeback. Yorktown was the triumph. Long Island was a beating. The army caught, enveloped, broken, and chased into a swamp. There is no flag raising in it, no decisive turn. There is only a brilliant escape from a disaster, and escapes do not make the kind of myth that nations like to tell their children. It was overshadowed. The very next dramatic act, Washington recrossing the Delaware in the snow on Christmas night to strike at Trenton, was so perfectly shaped for legend that it swallowed the memory of the dark autumn that came before it. We remember the comeback and forget how far down the army had to come back from. And its heroism was the wrong shape. The Maryland 400 did everything a culture asks of its heroes. They stood, they charged, they died for others. But they did it in defeat, covering a retreat, and most of them ended in unmarked graves. Their sacrifice has no monument that everyone knows, because it served a withdrawal, not a victory. That last point deserves its own moment, because the Maryland story does not quite end on the battlefield. The state of Maryland is nicknamed, to this day, the Old Line State, and the most enduring tradition holds that the name honors the Maryland Line, those troops who held when others ran, whose discipline Washington came to rely on, whose first and most terrible stand was at the Old Stone House. A whole state carries its identity, 2.5 centuries later, from 400 men who turned around in a lost battle. And the men themselves? The mass grave of the Maryland 400, the place where the dead of the Old Stone House were buried, somewhere in the Brooklyn ground near where they fell, has never been definitively found. Generations of historians and archaeologists have searched the streets of Gowanus, now paved over with row houses and warehouses and the ordinary city, for the trench where the Maryland dead were laid, the men who charged 6 times and never rose from the last one. It is somewhere under Brooklyn. We do not know where. The Old Stone House itself was buried under fill in the 19th century, then unearthed, then reconstructed with some of its original stones, and stands today in a small park, a quiet Dutch farmhouse surrounded by a neighborhood that walks past it every day without knowing what happened against its walls. That is how history actually treats its most important moments. Not with monuments and parades, but with row houses built over the graves, and a state nickname whose origin most of its own people could not explain, and a towering column in a Brooklyn park that no one visits. The wonder is not that Long Island was forgotten. The wonder, given everything, is that we can still reconstruct it at all, and that, once you know it, you can never again repeat the comfortable little lie about the trap that killed 1/3 of the British Army, because you have stood in the real one. So go back to the number we started with. The forgotten trap that killed 1/3 of the British Army in America. There was a forgotten trap. It was one of the most flawless maneuvers ever executed on a battlefield. A night march of 10,000 men in total silence, around the flank, through a door left open, into the rear of an enemy who never knew they were coming. It worked perfectly. It shattered 1/3 of the army it caught. But it was a British trap, sprung by Sir William Howe and designed by Sir Henry Clinton, and it closed on George Washington. The 1/3 that was lost was American. The British buried 60-some men. And the only reason there is a country whose people now repeat the story upside down is that the trap, perfect as it was, did not quite finish its work, stopped one afternoon short by a haunted general's caution, held off one crucial day by a wind out of the northeast, and beaten in the end by a fog and a fleet of rowboats. That is the truth of Long Island, not a triumph. A near execution survived by inches and by luck, and by the deliberate sacrifice of men who chose to die in a swamp so that others could live. It is darker than the legend, and it is far more worth remembering, because it tells you something the legend hides, that the United States did not begin in confidence. It began in catastrophe, pressed against a river, looking for a way out in the dark. The myth says the giant fell into the snare and bled. The truth is that the underdog walked into the snare, watched 1/3 of his men go down, and crawled out the back through the fog while the snare setter, for one fatal afternoon, decided to wait. Sometimes history remembers the wrong army. Sometimes the number is real, and the direction is a lie. And sometimes a revolution survives not because it won, but because, on one storm-blown August night, it managed not to be there when the morning came. The trap closed on August 27th. By the 30th, there was no one left in the trenches to catch. And the war that should have ended in Brooklyn went on for 7 more years, long enough in the end to win.